Okay, welcome back to Sharing the Brain. This is episode 2, season 2, our presumption that a second season is better than the first. And we are so excited to welcome back to the show a guest who participated in the first season of the show. But before we get to our guest, I should say that I'm Steve Magadance, and I'm here with my colleague, Stu. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Stu.
Good morning, everybody. I guess it's morning where we are. I'm Stu Guthrie, good friend and colleague of Steve Magadance, and we're very happy to have Miss Dr. Donohoo back with us. Steve, read her bio and let's get going.
Yeah, Dr. Jenni Donohoo, she is not just a 3-time best-selling author, but she just told us that she's now a 4-time best-selling author on her work around Teacher Collective Efficacy. She's worked in school districts and at the oversight level in school districts in Ontario, Canada. And we are so welcome Dr. Jenni Donohoo back to Sharing the Brain. Jenni, welcome back.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for connecting with me.
Yeah, thanks for connecting with us. And I know that Stu is really interested in the work that you continue to do around Teacher Collective Efficacy, and he had some thoughts about the conversation that we might continue that we had begun in season 1. Stu, take it.
I will, but first I have to, and there's Lollie. She never leaves my side too long. And before we started today, we asked Jenni if she would share her dogs with us. And so at the end of our podcast today, she promised to take us down and introduce her to her 2 beautiful dogs. We got a preview, and they are in fact beautiful dogs.
They are beautiful.
But Jenni, to start off, Teacher Collective Efficacy, a lot of the components that I've picked out and used at the school I work with is always sharing back with our teachers those things that they've done that they've been success. It's like fulfilling the cycle. They put in the hard work, the kids put in the hard work, they have results. You have to celebrate that. And at our school, we tied in optimistic closure, which is kind of a social emotional wellness or learning. And we turned that in a little bit to feeding that collective efficacy. Now, obviously, COVID-19 changed a lot about our schools. And I'm curious about how those 2 things in your mind kind of tie together. The forced distance learning, teachers' forced distance learning, and the Teacher Collective Efficacy. If you have thoughts about that, I think it'd be a great place to start today.
I do. And so I love the idea that you talked about the hard work and success, because for efficacy to be enhanced, people have to understand that it was their efforts, right? And they have to be successful in things that they might not think they are able or capable of achieving. So by making that connection and helping people understand through feedback that it's their effort, their joint work, that's what makes them successful, I think is really critical. So in this time of COVID-19, I've started to think, we know this, so the sources of efficacy you touched on is that success, that mastery, that firsthand experience is critically important. But so are affective states. That's one of the 4 sources, and it speaks to the feelings that people have. They can be negative or positive. So negative affective states are fear and anxiety, and those become efficacy diminishing, and positive affective states are sources of joy and pleasure and excitement and accomplishment, and those are efficacy enhancing. So I think in this time of COVID-19, we run into a real concern with the negative affective states taking over and diminishing individual and collective efficacy, because we know that teachers are anxious with the uncertainty, and that they haven't maybe had some successful experiences teaching online, and so that nervousness might prevent them from taking risks or providing students with the opportunities for rich tasks. And so that's been some of the stuff going through my mind around the connection between what we're faced with right now and efficacy in schools.
And in a class I'm actually taking, it just coincidentally this semester is adult learning theory. And one of them it really interests me is transformational learning theory. And it talks about an event or some kind of thing that happens to someone. For example, an adult may get divorced and now they want to go back to school and have a new career. It changes how they go about learning. And the goal for me is to tie in adult learning theory to children, to young people like I work with. And COVID-19 fits in that perfectly. It talks about a traumatic event. And the first thing that we did, and Steve and I talked about this in season 2, episode 1, was making them feel connected. And that actually was our word for the week, that first week back, is connect. Not just to make sure they could connect on Google Classroom and the platforms, but make sure we were connecting with them and letting them know that they are going to be okay. Even if we didn't always know that for sure, we wanted them to feel like they were going to be okay with us. You know, we weren't going to give them something else to worry about. So I thought that was another tie-in that just happened to kind of fall in my lap, so to speak, educationally.
You're making me think of a study that I came across a couple months ago, and it's that notion of a traumatic event. And it was research that was done out of Australia based on the tsunami that hit Thailand in the 2004 Boxing Day. And what they did, there's of course, massive destruction along the Thai coast. And the researchers looked at the communities to see if collective efficacy could account for their adaptive capacity to effectively recover from that disaster. And regardless of the amount of damage, collective efficacy was high in some communities that were extremely destroyed, and then it was also high in communities that had less destruction. So the amount of destruction didn't account for the collective efficacy, but what the researcher found was where efficacy was established in these communities, they were able to recover much quicker. And it was because they talked about in the Thai culture, it's really a collectivist type society as opposed to an individualist. So when you were talking about that notion of being connected, you're making me think of that study. And so applying that to what we're going through now, what we've been seeing, and this is, you know, not through studies, but
Sure.
you know, just through our observations, where collective efficacy was already established, school districts were much more able to deal with the impact of COVID-19 in a much more resourceful way. And I don't know if that's been your experience as well, or your observations.
Well, I can anecdotally, I think I love that study. I think I would agree with the premise of it. If efficacy exists, then weathering the storm, so to speak. That's a bad euphemism maybe for this example, but like weathering that kind of change, that like response to a crisis, I think is much more positive. It was in my, or I perceived it to be that way in my learning community, where teachers felt as though they had the power, they had the responsibility, they had the ability to create a learning environment. Now they did it in an immensely quick turnaround time. And so I feel like, you know, going forward, and there's this sort of this question of uncertainty, you know, what's it going to look like for us in August when we start school again? But I feel like the teachers that I work with on a regular basis know that they have the ability to cultivate that learning environment that will serve their students, despite the uncertainty. And so we left kind of with that charge at the end of the school year is, you know, here are the things that we're thinking about as a district level in terms of delivery models. How do you make your instructional environment fluid to transition between those possible models, right? And I feel like the teachers were confident in their abilities to do that, and their power to do that. Mm-hmm. So I agree with that. I like that. I'm glad you brought that up.
No, I think it's a great point. And I felt the same way. And Steve and I, we don't talk about our district by name. There's no reason. We just have always kind of set that up as just to be that way. But it's interesting also, as you talk about, like from our level as principals to our teachers, our district level to us, they were in the same boat. This is something that nobody else has had to deal with. And I thought they did a fantastic job. And Steve and I both have talked about that and shared that all of that fits together. It's not just one teacher, it's a group of teachers. It's not just one principal, it's a group of principals, you know, and all the way down. What are your thoughts about that big picture? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I think like kind of in a connected way, like if we think about some of the methodology in creating, maintaining, or stewarding collective efficacy, what does that look like from distance, right? Because I think that Stu and I both probably went through different permutations of continuing professional development, continuing to connect with teachers, but doing it from distance. And there was lots of fumbling, right? I'm sure I made a ton of mistakes in how to do things from distance in the attempts that I made. But like what, if anything, is out there? Like how maybe in an online synchronous, asynchronous environment, how does efficacy, how is it maintained for institutions that are doing that kind of work? And how can that inform school systems going forward when they weren't, delivering education, online or from distance? Like, how do we maintain it in a distance environment? That's my question. That's what I'm wondering.
I think that's a great question. And I didn't listen in on this webinar, but a friend of mine told me that Professor Hattie delivered a webinar, I think it was Wednesday this week. And one of the points he made was, who would have thought 6 months ago that we could have an experiment where all of a sudden all of the schools in the whole world are closed. And so his point was we could take this as a learning opportunity, like what an experiment, research that we can. And I think that the question you pose is one that needs to be figured out in the next couple months, right? Yeah. It's I don't know if anybody really has the answer, but we could look to what we know are the sources of efficacy and try to capitalize on those 4 sources, like successful experiences, and making sure that those are shared and that they are realized. And then those vicarious experiences where we see that teams are having success and trying to make sure that we connect people so that they can see it's possible. Social persuasion and, like I said, those positive affective states, I think, are what we need to continuously focus on as efficacy shaping sources.
No, that's a good point. And I'll tell you one thing that we will always be good at is the Zoom meeting, because I will tell you, and if I don't require or even request our own teachers watch my own podcast, or we would have more than 29 followers or whatever it is. But I don't ask them to watch a podcast. My point to this was on the Zoom meetings, I have them all captive. I can see their faces. And so that is one thing. And using technology, I know some of our teachers were a little hesitant, what do I do? How do I connect with kids? And that is one thing that we have absolutely going to grow with after all this COVID-19, how to connect with kids more on their level rather than waiting for them to come to us in our classroom. And I have some teachers already talking about doing Zoom tutorials like they did during this past 9 weeks into the next year, because kids can connect in the evening, 5 o'clock or whatever, when they're able to get to their computer. So we are going to grow from this for sure. It's our responsibility, I think, as all educators, is to make sure we do it, because if we don't grow from this, then it's straight on us. It's our fault, to be sure. Now that brings up a topic that we kind of kicked around a little bit before we got started. Not every kid has a device. Giving a kid a device does not equal equity either. And we know that we live in a world, unfortunately, that's just that way. It's not equitable for every student. We do feel a great responsibility, and Steve, you can talk about this a lot more eloquently than I can, that we do have a responsibility to provide equity for our kids. How does all that tie in? Steve, why don't you talk about what your thoughts were, and then let's see what Dr. Donohoo has to add to that.
Sure. I don't know how eloquent I'll be about it, but I'm something that's been tumbling around in my head. I mean, I think that, like Stu said, Dr. Donohoo, that this pandemic and our response to it has illuminated, I think, some of the inequities that exist to marginalized communities in our systems. And it's not always just putting a device in someone's hand. I mean, there are numerous other factors that go into a student and a family's daily experience that create inequity, right? And just mentioned it is kind of a systemic structural challenge that communities are dealing with, both on global and local levels. Like, considering this idea of efficacy, considering this idea of equitable delivery of instruction for students, and accounting for those systemic, cultural, even sometimes challenges that exist. Like, what can campus leaders be thinking about? What can district leaders be thinking about to help evolve the way we deliver instruction in the long term? Like, we know, I think we could argue that a digital environment creates an opportunity at a more rich level of instructional delivery than might a paper packet, right? And there were several local articles in the San Antonio area that were looking at how districts responded, providing continuous instruction. So, I mean, I think that when I think about how we provide instruction or how we create equitable access to marginalized groups, that's something that continues to concern me, is the wrong word, but it continues to be something that I'm struggling with how to do, and how to provide the support for teachers to provide. I don't know how eloquent that was, but there it is.
No, it's definitely a concern. And you made me just think about and I pulled up a chapter from the book that I'm just currently working on. And I hope you'll forgive me, but I thought you made me think of a spot in it, and I'm just going to read a couple lines.
Please.
And it's my own writing, but I thought this is it. I said it really, I think what I want to say is what I've written here. Well, let me tell you a bit about this book. So your timing's funny because, this book is my fifth now. My co-author is Dr. Stephanie Height. We wrote this book over the course of the last year. And when we turned it in a couple months ago, well, what our editor, Dan Alpert, had brought to our attention was the theme of equity was in this book. And in the examples that we were sharing, what we're trying to do is show examples in schools where both collective efficacy and student achievement coexist. Like that's the next step. I think people are wondering, we know what collective efficacy is, we know why it's important, but where is it happening in action? Where can I learn from other administrators or teachers or teams where they've realized it? So the criteria for the book was that we could show efficacy was in existence and where we had data that student achievement increased. Well, our editor, as he was reading the first draft, said, you could probably take this sub-theme of inequity because in all of your cases, you're showing that there's been a reduction in achievement gaps. And so we spent the last couple months taking that lens and looking at it more closely. And one of the lines I have is, in order to address the challenges of inequity in education, teachers must perceive themselves to be both individually and collectively capable of delivering effective instruction to underperforming and or disadvantaged students in a way that will result in students' better performance and increased academic achievement. The more salient teachers' perceptions of the obstacles posed by students' socioeconomic status, race, or ethnicity, the lower their expectations and goals. And we know, of course, the danger of low expectations. And so a diminished sense of efficacy would result in less effort, less lack of receptiveness to integrate new approaches into practice. So there's such a danger when efficacy doesn't exist, especially when we're talking about the inequities that have been posed by COVID-19 that have always existed, of course. So the question becomes, what can we do to ensure that teachers feel a sense of efficaciousness in addressing, the challenges that we faced? And so I guess I come back to those sources, and besides the sources of efficacy, we know that there's contextual factors, which of course pose additional questions in this time when we're not in a confined environment together. But one of the contextual factors that I think we can still continue to really enable is the notion of empowering teachers. And I think what I've heard you guys talking about is that, there's opportunities to make sure that we continue to allow teachers the autonomy to do that difficult work. I've seen some examples where, in districts where I think efficacy was lacking, erratic decision-making, very much driven as opposed to like telling teachers exactly what they needed to do, being very prescriptive and taking away the autonomy and, not even very timely communication. So I think that just making sure that we value teachers as professionals. It's a quote from Fullen and Hargrave's Professional Capital. They say, sustainable and successful school improvement can't be done to or even for teachers. It can only be achieved by and with them. And I love that quote. It resonates with me because we know that they have the experience and expertise. We just need to make sure that we connect them, support them, and make sure that they feel that they have a sense of autonomy.
I think that's a great answer, Dr. Donohoo. And Steve, I don't know if you caught that, but I think we just got the opening, a glimpse into the best-selling book by Dr. Donohoo.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's called breaking news. Nobody else has heard this book.
You get it here first.
That's right. I think that's how we're going to title this podcast: Breaking News.
Yeah, exclusive.
Exclusive. There you go.
Unintended exclusive, perhaps. It makes me think too. We talk a lot about like in the delivery of education, and Stu, I think we talked about it in episode 1 of this season that sometimes there is this perspective that education is done to students,
Right.
and the idea of doing it with students is what creates powerful learning. I appreciate that, it's translated into adult learning, right? And so it's still learning, it's still creating an experience that is shared, that people can be accountable to have some powerful outcomes. I think that's really great to hear.
Yeah,
I look forward to that book.
Absolutely. And what we talked about, Dr. Donohoo, although I'm sure you watched it, our last episode, in this whole moment of the COVID-19, I really challenged our kids. I made a video and I sent it to all of them, and I just told them, you be in charge of your own learning, own your own learning at this time. There's a book that I'll link it at the end with some of these other articles that we've talked about, if anybody wants to go look them up. But that idea of owning your own learning has been really like in my forefront in thinking about next year. Teachers are great at leading discussions and providing information, providing content. The term I've kind of picked up at our school is I want them to be more of a Sherpa at times, and that is guide them along. Let the students own their learning. That takes a lot of risk. You have 30 middle school kids in a classroom. I'm not 100% sure everybody's comfortable just saying, all right, kids, what do y'all want to do? And obviously it's not that, but there is something about that Sherpa mentality. And from our perspective as leaders, letting teachers know that's okay, right? To give up some of that.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about owning your own learning with kids and the collective efficacy piece?
Well, you were making me think of student efficacy and the impact of students' own efficacy about what they can accomplish and can't. And according to John Hattie's effect size research, it has an effect size of 0.71. So it's up there. And, especially now in this online environment where students have to take more initiative and be more motivated, we have to make sure that they feel a sense of efficacy and ownership over their learning. And I think sometimes that's hard for teachers to give up that control. And maybe based on what's going on, it might be a little bit easier, to give up some control, because I think maybe they don't have much of a choice at this point.
That's true.
Yeah.
When I talk about John Hattie's research, self-reported grades is maybe the top, or I don't know if they've adjusted them recently. And that's something that we are trying to work into our schedule for next year. We're going to do some more work within interventions during the school day, followed up by student self-reported goals. If they can achieve more than they think they can, that's a powerful tool. And I think it leads to what you're talking about, that student efficacy. Just as a benefit for me, maybe as a student here, can you talk a little bit about student self-reported grades and how that might look? And I'm just going to be taking notes, so don't worry about me, okay?
Okay. So when John Hattie's 2009 book came out, the first synthesis, he had 150 influences ranked, and self-reported grades was listed as number 1 with an effect size of 1.33. And as he continues to update that, now that book is over 10 years old, he's added 250 influences, and now self-reported grades is second only to collective teacher efficacy. And he regretted, I don't know if that's the right word, but I thought I heard him say once that he regretted naming it self-reported grades because people didn't really know what that meant. And so in the Visible Learning for Teachers, he renamed it to students' expectations, which is, I think, a better descriptor for people to understand. And, that idea of making students their own best self-assessors is I think, the critical part of that where students have that confidence, but they also, he talks about the idea that students are pretty accurate. They know where they are. And if they think they are a C student, then they'll live up to that self-fulfilling prophecy. Our job is to mix that up and to change the narrative. As teachers' expectations has an effect size of 0.43, so not as powerful as students' expectations. But what the research shows is where teachers have a sense of individual and collective efficacy, they tend to raise students' expectations of themselves by convincing kids that they can do well in school. And I think that's how those two influences fit together in a critical and important way.
Yeah, that's good stuff. So I have a question for you. When are you going to come down to Texas so Steve and I can do a remote podcast, come see you at a seminar somewhere, get to meet you finally, besides Zoom, although this is meeting, I guess, in a way these days. Do you have any plans or anything coming up? Of course, nothing's on hold now, but.
Yeah, I was scheduled to be in Texas last week. There was a reading recovery conference, I and so that I was supposed to be there for that. And, I think it's postponed. So when they reschedule that event, I will definitely let you know. And when you guys are, you probably don't come to Canada very often, but if we just bought a home in New Orleans.
Oh, wow.
So if you're ever in New Orleans, you can come visit me.
There is nothing wrong with New Orleans. I told Steve, I'm really good at lunch. We had Zoom lunches with our kids during the COVID-19. And that was always one of my best subjects as a kid. I wear black because it's so slimming on me. Trust me. Steve, what else you got? I know we're going to get to meet Dr. Donohoo's dogs. What else?
I think that was a perfect segue. I think like the invitation to come to San Antonio is open. You should know that our Fiesta event was postponed to November, and I know it gets kind of cold in Canada, so that's a perfect time to visit San Antonio and enjoy some of our beautiful weather and Fiesta if you happen to be looking at your calendar ahead. And in an odd twist of fate, I was scheduled to be in Ontario this week in far northwestern Ontario for a trip to fish, but that got canceled, unfortunately.
Okay.
So we look forward to that possibility, and I think you're going to go downstairs and show us your puppies.
Awesome.
Figure out where they are. Yeah, you guys. So the last time I talked to you, I was in New Orleans.
Yeah.
We vacation there a lot, and my stepson just got his real estate license. We're his first sale.
Oh,
nice. Congratulations.
At our time, we'll probably sell this house that we're in now. We probably won't be able to maintain them both. Okay, so we'll cut all that, and then let me come on, Stella.
We don't cut anything, Dr. Don. He'll just all say
he's totally
this is
lying.
the fun part. Yeah, this is the fun part.
Oh, look at those dogs.
And there's my Lucy. Can you see her okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. All right, come here, Lollie. You wanted to see. Come here.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great visit. Thank you for sharing your puppies with us. It looks like Lollie got camera shy all of a sudden.
No, you kidding me?
Oh, there she is. Okay.
She wants her own podcast. I can just tell. She's waiting for me to get out of the way so she can do her own thing. But Dr. Donohoo, thanks for that. Steve, you want to?
No, I was going to say exactly that. Dr. Donohoo, thanks for joining us again for season 2. And we're so glad that we were able to have an extended conversation with you about your research and your work around Teacher Collective Efficacy. And it's been really informative. I learned a lot from listening, and I look forward to reading your new book and your new books coming out, and hopefully having another conversation either in person or in another episode of Sharing the Brain.
That'd be great.
All right, thanks again. And we'll put links to all of Dr. Donohoo's books at the end of the video here. And it was so good to see you again with a good connection. This is a lot of fun for us, as you know, and take care, and we will see you next time.
Take care.